I intend to make this the most comprehensive beginner routine you'll ever see. So I strongly recommend you watch until the end. Even if you're a Valorant player, don't skip the tracking part because it all contains very vital information that I promise you will be using. This is essentially a collection of 15 years of aim experience, well over 1,000 clients, and the experience of hundreds of well-known aimers I've talked to over the years. We're going to be covering a lot of things I've covered in my past videos. Firstly, we'll talk a little bit about how things are called, why they're called a little bit like that, and stuff like that. So we'll begin with static. Frequently what you'll see is the word one wall 6 TE, for example. So what does that mean? One wall, it's one wall, and you will often see a W sometimes as well. 6 means 6 targets, and TE is referring to the size. So TE is the largest size pretty much possible. Some other frequently common terms are, for example, jumbo, extra large, etc., etc. If you then searches same thing, but TS, it means targets small. One wall, 6 targets, target small. Or one wall, 6 targets, small. And reload obviously stands that there's a magazine, which you see at the bottom, which reloads when you misses. You can go a step further and write an E extra small, and now the targets will be even smaller. So that's the basics. There's also something called wide wall, which is shortened by WW, which essentially is a wider wall where there's usually the angles are way broader. Some people also spell it out, but it's more common to write W and W. There's also something called micro scenarios, which usually these micro scenarios don't have one specific name. Sometimes they'll be called micro click, sometimes they'll be called clusters, sometimes they're called hip fire. But the general consensus of this is to work your micros, very short ranged flicks. Everything's very close together. It's clustered, is another word for it. Same rules apply here. It's one wall, 4 targets, and the targets are small. Okay, there's also something called 3D clicking, and this is all static, by the way. Something called 3D clicking, which is that the distance of the bot is varied. So this guy is essentially closer to me, which means that he will be larger. You see how there's a 3D atmosphere. So now that we know some of the terminologies, what is static? Static is essentially, as you've seen, stationary bots that don't move whatsoever. They just stand still and you go from target to target shooting them. And a lot of you people might be asking, why is this useful? Why am I even playing this? Well, in its simplicity, it's actually very, very complicated. And I'll talk about some common mistakes you'll probably do. The point of this is to see how you respond to the target appearing and how quickly can you flick, micro, and click that a target to either begin the tracking or complete the headshot. You can see how that's a very foundational step. So the first thing I want you to learn is something called visual confirmation. What this is that we're confirming and seeing with our eyes that we are on target now and it's okay to click. Which you may think is obvious, but it's really not. Once speed becomes implied, a lot of people will just start to spam and that will lead to randomness, which is a huge thing. We want to eliminate, as a beginner, any randomness. Why? Because randomness is essentially your brain's ability to fill in the gaps of what it believes should happen. So if you're pushing speed really fast, for example, you're incorporating more randomness because your brain doesn't know what to do. And that can lead to random spamming, for example, because it assumes it's on target, but it's not, and it clicks. That assumption is a form of randomness, and we want to weed out as much randomness as humanly possible. Because Kovaaks is a habit builder, if you keep spamming, you'll then go into game, see a target, and attack it with the same form of randomness. You'll assume you're on target, you'll click, and most likely miss, or even if you hit, it will purely be random because your brain is trying to fill in the gap and assume and just guess where the enemy is. We want to eliminate as much guessing and incorporate as much knowing as humanly possible. That's why visual confirmations are so important, because they remove the guessing factor. They remove your ability's need to fill in the gaps and know how exactly to flick during a specific situation. So go to target. Yes, I'm on target, click. Yes, I'm on target, click. Yes, I'm on target, click. Yes. And important here is that at the beginning, it will be a little slower. At the beginning, your score will take a hit, but as time goes on, you will do way better, and you'll notice in game your shots are way more consistent. And that's what we want to look at. As a beginner, focus on consistency and focus on not making mistakes more so than being flashy and trying to jump these steps. You don't need to, as a beginner, go super fast and go crazy. Be calm. Make sure that the first step is always on target. I'm unsure I'm on target. I'm sure I'm on target. I'm sure I'm on target. A way to do this, if it doesn't mentally click for you, is to never click the edges of the bot, but always the dead center. Essentially, what this does is sort of removes our brain's autopiloting function, which is very common in static because of how easy it is. But because of how easy it is, it will then allow for more, mistakes to come in. So our body will essentially see, we're not where we want to be. Let's adjust. Let's adjust. Let's adjust. And that little bit of adjustment can be used as a visual confirmation. Very, very important. You focus on 95 to 100% accuracy as a beginner. So the most important thing is I could teach you is that there's a time and a place for everything. If the target, for example, is larger, you don't have to overly focus on the rules, but you can let your mouse fly a little bit more. This essentially encourages more speed to be pushed, so we don't have to always focus on accuracy or always speed. Different scenarios call for different things. A big thing I want you to keep in mind is the difference between flicking speed and clicking speed. I can move as fast as humanly possible without clicking. The point of visual confirmation is that we don't click because we end our mouse movement, but we click because we know we're on target. So you can flick and take your time, flick and take your time, flick and take. This will incorporate a lot of speed where you can actually push speed, but still confirm that you're on target. See how I haven't missed a single shot and I'm still moving fast. Why? Because my flicking speed is completely different to my clicking speed. I can move as fast as possible, as you can see here, and I'm still confirming. But some people will overly push speed and they will just start clicking like this, like crazy. And that's what you want to avoid. So again, flicking and clicking speed, separate things. Focus on confirmations. Even when speed is applied, just you can be a little bit more lenient on the confirmations. For example, these clustered scenarios are another place where speed may be encouraged and you don't have to sit and visually confirm all the time. And that's the point of the exercise. This is what's known as intuition aiming and relies purely on your initial reaction. How do you handle flicking and clicking, being pressured, or being generally forced to go fast without any technique involved? And like we said earlier, there's a time and a place for everything, and everything is worth working, especially if you showcase specific flaws within that area. When, for example, playing more reflex scenarios, which we'll get into as well, you'll know that you don't really have the time to confirm. Another important thing about confirmations, only do them in Kovaaks, not in game. So it's best here to use common sense. If the targets are larger, if the targets are closer together, then focus on speed. If the targets are smaller, there's wider distances to cover, then focus on accuracy and confirmations. Important here is to not be stagnant with one technique. If you're playing a scenario like this, you don't want to be moving slowly and taking your time. You want to let your mouse fly a little bit because different scenarios work different types of your aim. Every scenario and every person is unique, so there's not really one general answer. Now, let's talk about initial speed. So, your flick is usually split into two parts. This is an initial. Wherever you first move your mouse, that is the initial. Usually as a beginner, your initial will be too far, too short, or generally around the target. This is a micro, the recoverability, not this, not this. Initial, micro, initial, micro. Okay, a good aimer usually has an equal amount of speed in the initial and the micro. making it appear like one smooth flick. So if you look at some really good aimer, usually his micro may not even be visible due to the speed of the micro being identical to the initial flick. And that's what you want to reach. The issues many people have with the initial flick is essentially the initial being very fast and the micro being very slow, creating a discorrelation and less recoverability, because when you go to micro in game, you'll be too slow when the target's already moved. And what I see commonly used is a very fast initial that leads into you flicking anywhere near the bot, and then a very slow adjustment, like this. There's a variety of reasons why this is bad, and I strongly recommend you checking out some of the videos linked right here. But to keep it short, there's 3 things I want you to do to solve this. Number 1 is to focus on your decelerations, and I'll show you a great picture right here. So if you look at this first person right here, he's under flicking and having the same speed on his micro as his initial flick, which leads to a 200 millisecond time to reach the target. This person, however, has a very fast initial, faster than the first guy, but his micro is so slow because he's so fast and he doesn't decelerate, which leads to a longer time to kill. Prolonged micro happens because the initial speed is so fast that it causes an abrupt halt, which we'll talk about very soon. You can see here in the game, this is where your shot will land because initial is too fast and the micro is too slow. So in game, it's usually not this. In game, it's usually boom, and you're just shooting where you land, especially if you play some TAC FPS, some Siege, some Valorant, stuff like this. That's why it's really, really important to have those initials on point, and we'll talk about how to do that when we address Pokeball. So how do we work on this getting a better initial? Firstly, is to understand different things work for different people. I wish there was a general answer, and that would certainly make my job a lot easier. But I'm going to give you 3 things that you can experiment with and try it on yourself to see what works. Number 1 is to flick and focus on the decelerations. You're essentially focusing on, hey, I'm close to the target, I should slow my mouse down a little bit while at the same time keeping constant movement. I don't want an abrupt halt like this. Okay, this is a halt in my mouse movement, which will prolong the time to reach the target. I want to keep constant mouse movement, and that requires that, hey, I'm kind of close to the target, I will slightly slow down my speed instead of having this jolt. Okay, we want to avoid that snappiness. Number 1, focus on decelerations, play a run of that, look at the accuracy, look at your consistency, and then jump to technique number 2, which is to look at the target before or during mouse movement. So most people are blind and then they'll look at target. Flick, blind, and then they'll look at target. This creates an overt focus on the peripheral vision rather than the paracentral vision. And you want to keep it mainly to your paracentral vision because that's where your eye's focus mainly is. Especially if you're playing something like Valorant and you really need to focus on your accuracy. So we look where we're going before flicking. I'm looking at the target, instead of just assuming you will land anywhere near the target. We want to remove randomness, remove assumptions, and instead fill it with intent and purpose on how to move. We do that by looking at the target before or during mouse movement. So number 3, I want you to try that out, see how it works for you, look at the accuracy stat, don't look at the score, look at the consistency. What that means is, are you consistently hitting flicks faster? Are you consistently on target more? Does it feel better rather than the score at this stage? That will come later on. The last technique I want you to do is to underflick on purpose. Constantly underflick rather than overflick. That because if I move past the target, I have to move twice as much. It's twice the distance I have to move. But if I underflick on purpose, I have some time to still see the target and adjust my trajectory. Same thing with that, try it, see how it is. And then after you gathered all the information, after you tried all techniques, is when I want you to focus on one of those techniques and play it for a long time. As I said, there's a time and a place for everything. The goal here isn't for you to keep this technique all the time. The goal as a beginner is for you to build good fundamentals, build good habits, so when you're being pressured in game or when you're being pressured in Kovaaks, when more difficult scenarios arise, you will then be more consistent and your brain doesn't have to fill in the gaps with randomness, but know what to do. So a lot of people might hear all these things and move overly slow. I don't want you to move overly slow either. Some people will need to focus a little bit more on accuracy and other people focus more on speed. But in general, if you can't do the basics, if you can't hit a target this large fast, you probably can't hit a much smaller target fast. So don't try to jump into the most difficult or hardest thing as a beginner. You want to make sure that, hey, I can hit these targets very fast and very comfortably before I move on to something like this, which requires more precision. Because in game, you're going to need speed. And if you can't even hit these targets, you can't expect to hit the smaller ones in game either. The number one thing to keep in mind when practicing static and for all your aim is to focus on the habits as a beginner. Don't forget a thing called score whatsoever. Focus on building good habits. Spend a month, spend a week, spend 3 weeks, focusing purely on one thing, getting good at the habits, not over flicking, for example, maybe if that's an issue. Focus only on that. Forget about anything else and focus on consistency. Once you're consistently not over flicking, that is during speed and during accuracy, that's when you begin to look into the next step. But spend your time sort of isolating one mistake at a time and not trying to jump into the hardest possible thing you could ever do because you're not seeing results. The point now isn't to see drastic, flashy, insane results. It's to build your ground, build your base, your foundation. Because without that, in the future, things will be a lot harder. Trust me, this is speaking from experience. Going back to having to fix your mistakes and then still having them linger is way harder, way more annoying than just figuring out from the beginning, doing everything correct. You will learn 10 times faster. There's a time for improvement, there's a time for flashiness, there's a time for score, and there's a time to work on the basics, and that is right now. The faster you get to the basics and just get it done, the better. After you've done that, look back and please take notes, mainly how you felt, not how your score was. Why? Because our brain is way smarter than you think. The goal here is to look for consistency rather than flashiness. So while you may get a better score being faster, it may not be the appropriate step as a beginner. Weeding out your bad flaws is the priority. And remember, there's a time and a place for everything. You'll be able to push speed in the future once you have the basic techniques down. If you like the way I analyze things and break it down, do consider signing up for my coaching. Now, let's talk about dynamic. Dynamic is another scenario where you click one bullet per target. You're not holding down mouse one, you're clicking. These scenarios are essentially moving targets. Many common things I see here are similar to static, where they'll have a hard initial and then try to adjust after that. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have that randomness of a hard initial, because what do we teach in game? This is where your first shot will land, not the adjustment. The initial flick is far more important, especially if you're playing some TAC FPS game where accuracy is required. So how do we build that? Number one is something called target reading. For example, this bot was just here. I don't want to flick to where he was. I want to flick to where he will be, intercepting him. That's what's called target reading. So instead of me flicking to this person's old position, usually where I first saw him, I want to intercept. Oh, he'll be here in the next frame, so I'll intercept where he's going. What this creates is, if somebody's peeking you in Valorant, you don't want to have to flick to his old position and then do a micro back. You want to flick to where he stops. That's why we target read. Secondly, is to track for a millisecond before clicking. And this goes back to our visual confirmation. Because if we don't track and we start spamming, what will we do in game? We won't track and we'll spam. And by overly relying on clicking, we're essentially cutting off half of our aim and saying, hey, this is useless, instead of using it to assist our consistency. So the important thing, sometimes I see people, they track for like a full second and then click, full second. That's not what I'm going to do. Just a short, hey, I'm on target, hey, I'm on target, hey, I'm on target, hey, I'm on target, I'm on target. Very short, so to weed out the randomness. We do all of this to... Number one thing I would say, avoid spamming. I don't want you to spam. in dynamic. Because why? You'll get into game, you'll be very near the target, and you'll just be spamming all the time. We want to, again, weed out all the randomness, weed out all the spam, show your body exactly how to properly do things, rather than having the negative side effects show up in game. So a huge point of dynamic isn't just to be shooting moving targets, it's to recover after doing a failed initial flick. So what does that mean, and how is it different a little bit from micro? So let's say you still have some bad habits and you are going to miss, so I miss my shot. How do I then recover? How does my micro then look like? And in static, these targets would be completely still, but here they're moving. So how do we incorporate our target reading and our micro? That is essentially what dynamic is working. So how do we recover after a miss? That is a huge thing that will cover a lot of games. So firstly, we're going to cover something called Pokeball. Number one, Pokeball may look like static, but it's not. Why? Because we're holding down mouse 1 all the time to reach our target. I'm not clicking. This is click. Hopefully you can hear my mouse. I'm holding down my mouse 1 all the time, going from target to target. Why do we do this? Essentially, by cutting off any need for any other input. In static, we have an input required to click, when to click. In Pokeball, we're cutting that off and just focusing on your mouse movements. How does it look like to just move your mouse to the target and work on the first step? How do I move my mouse to reach the target? That's why it's super important, specifically in all types of Pokeball as a beginner, to actually focus on clean lines. What does clean lines mean? Number one, no micro. This is a micro. Okay? None of this stuff. Because what will you do when you go into static or go into game? Boom, boom. Whatever you do in Kovaaks will come off in game. So how do we fix this? We essentially move at our own pace, slowly, making sure everything is flawless, perfect, no micro adjustment. This is what's called smooth pathing. We're creating a smooth path to the target. When you'll then be faced with a situation where targets are peeking you quick or you have to react very fast, it's essentially going to work your subconscious habit of how you respond to the target. So if I have clean lines, I can flick and click. If I have clean lines, flick and click. Very easy. If I have a broken line through not playing Pokeball or playing Pokeball incorrectly, I will flick and adjust, flick and adjust, flick and adjust. So it's working our mouse movements, which is why it's super important. And as a beginner, I don't recommend you going to the hardest, smallest Pokeball ever required. This is definitely a step for the future. If you're a beginner, it's very good to incorporate. Don't get me wrong, extra small static Pokeball is some of the best techniques, some of the best scenarios you could ever use. But don't shy away from the bigger stuff as a beginner, because if you're constantly overflicking when the targets are super small, you may not just have the mouse control yet to properly draw those clean lines, which is why, again, these larger targets are more necessary. Makes sense. It's sort of like going to the gym, starting off light. So this is TS, or target switching, which I know is confusing because we talked about one wall 6 TS, target small, and then target switching. It's a little confusing. Most of the time, if you hear the word Vox or switching or anything similar to that, it is usually a target switching scenario. You can usually tell if the target takes more than one shot to kill, it's more than likely a target switching scenario. And if your gun has a full auto ability, it's 100% a target switching or a Pokeball style of scenario. Target switching is essentially also you hold down mouse 1, really important, from target to target, except they're moving. So it's sort of like a moving version of Pokeball, and it's usually 3D, while Pokeball is 2D on just a singular wall. So what's the point of this? Remember how I told you this very important thing. There's a time and a place for everything. And in Pokeball, the point is to work our accuracy, our lines, moving slowly, blah, blah, blah. Here, the opposite applies. We want to focus on speed, on pushing ourselves and constantly moving faster. But don't get ahead of yourself and start rushing and start moving just as fast as possible. You want to move fast in a controlled way. So you want to focus on the same things we talked about in static, which is looking at the target decelerations, blah, 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 and then start to slowly move your hand faster while still focusing on those techniques. That's why I strongly recommend getting a good Pokeball foundation before moving on to target switching. Focus a week purely on Pokeball, so guess what? Your initial flick will land, because if you go into target switching and your initial flick is crazy, you may just risk actually messing up your aim more. But that's another important thing. You will miss your shots. So how do you then recover? That's exactly what target switching works on. The idea is when we incorporate speed, we will start missing, and that missing will require us to fix our misses. And by learning how to faster and more effectively recover after missing, we will then incorporate faster micros and faster recoverability. I recommend you slowly incorporate target switching and different forms of target switching, clustered, evasive, and etc. over time. I don't recommend you playing target switching slowly. Remember, there's a time and a place for everything. So if you're playing Pokeball slowly, don't play target switching slowly. Incorporate all forms of the art. Since in-game, there'll be times where you need to be slow and take your time, and where other times where you'll need to be really fast and get pressured. Don't be that one trick guy that gets stuck on only doing accuracy or only speed and only playing what you know. The quicker you get solid fundamentals, the quicker you can play these harder scenarios. So that's a little bit about flicking and about clicking. We'll soon move on to tracking. But before that, I thought we'll incorporate some of the things we talked about. So for example, in our playlist, we want to incorporate some speed. So we add a scenario like this, where we're required to push speed a lot. Okay, great. We also want to incorporate some accuracy. Okay, interesting. Let's incorporate some smaller targets. Great. We also want to incorporate and work on those decelerations, which required something wider. Usually for most people, these decelerations are a hard thing, so I recommend something larger like this. Again, there's no S here, which signifies small. The wider angles will essentially work our ability to decelerate and learn how to quickly attack information that is unseen or not a clear path. So for example, I don't see this target. How does my body respond to him when I then see him and during mouse movement? So I don't see this target. How does my body react when I'm sort of being close to him? That's what it's also working. It's not just that you'll always be flicking on these super wide angles in game. It's more about the habits you do with your mouse. Awesome. Now we might need some micro scenarios, which essentially are this, to work on those very fine movements that you need to do often in game. Awesome. So we have a complete list of static here. Let's go over to some Pokeball. Now, we got to incorporate some Pokeball as a beginner. The more angles you have, the more chance you have of getting a full, complete aim set, since in-game requires a lot of variety. No peak will ever be the same, and no circumstance will ever be the same. So we want to learn how to handle all situations, especially as a beginner. Since your issues as a beginner are probably everything and not just one hyper-specific thing, although it can feel like that at times. So we'll incorporate some wide ball stuff and larger stuff similar to static. We'll also incorporate some closer angles, and we'll, again, similar to static, work on some clustered stuff. So what do we have now? We have wider, larger angles that we can play. Really cool. We have some a little bit closer angles and a little bit smaller size that we can move from target to target. Really good. And then we have these much smaller, closer scenarios. So you see how we're attacking a variety of things. Same scenario style, but a variety of angles. Next, we want to essentially be able to shoot moving targets, right? So incorporating some Pasu is very, very recommended. I strongly recommend something like this. Why? The targets are moving slow, good for beginners. You only have one shot. So if you can't spam, because as soon as you miss, you're being punished. Really good, similar to how it is in game. And the targets are moving relatively slow. I also encourage you to play some linear clicking, which is just the most basic form of dynamic. A target is moving left to right and you aim and try to shoot him. Very good, very fun foundational exercise. Moving on to target switching, if you choose that this is a right step for you, you can either add more Pokeball or you can add a little bit of target switching. If you're a complete beginner, I recommend focusing hardly on Pokeball as a first step. But let's say you're at that step. Again, start with the easy stuff. Jumbo, it's large. And don't be afraid to generally attack scenarios that may seem or feel too easy, but aren't. And we'll talk about that in Smoothness, why some scenarios feel easy, but really, really aren't. So stick around until that. Here we have some smaller targets that move very slowly. You can comfortably move from target to target. Here we have way larger scenarios, so you can push speed a lot more and not be sort of afraid of letting your mouse fly a little bit. And then we have, again, clustered stuff, which is the scenarios are very close to each other and it allows for, again, a little bit more speed and closer angles. And we'll talk about how to structure this all at the end. So what you see in front of me is Smoothness. It's a bot moving in one direction in a predictable pattern. For the most time, it's pretty slow. It's just moving left to right. This is what's called linear tracking. It's only left to right. Something like this is what we'd call precision tracking, where it's a small bot. You can also call it air or evasive. It's essentially a small bot moving in, a little bit more finicky pattern where it's mixing up and doing slight changes of movements, but you can see it's still keeping the same pattern of moving left to right. There's also raw smoothness, which is very similar to linear smoothness. It's just doing a very predictable pattern on repeating the same thing over and over again. There's also bounce 180, which is very, very popular. You can see it's just moving very, very easily. And lastly, I'll cover speed matching, which essentially is the exact same thing, but the scenario is now moving way faster, where the goal of speed matching is really to match the target speed. It's really useful if you struggle with under tracking, for example, but it is one of those more advanced steps. I just want you to be aware that it's a thing you can hit in the future. So if you're playing a scenario like this and you display bad habits, shaking all over the place, or doing basic flaws consistently, for example, like this, no matter what the score is or how you feel, it may be a good idea to search for an easier scenario. You don't have to do this easier version forever, but spending a couple days really making sure those shakes or poor habits don't haunt you in the future is a strong recommend. I have a ton of videos about how to remove shaking, but as a beginner, you have to realize that you're shaking as a form of randomness and compensating because you don't know what will happen next instead of remaining smooth. It essentially is compensating for a lack of skill is the easiest way to put it. Try to aim more with your arm, watch some of my videos, and most importantly, above all, play an easier scenario where you don't shake. The way you find an easier version is very, very simple. You go into the search bar here and you click easier, you search easy, slower, for example, and it will essentially give you sometimes a larger, slower moving target than what we originally see. A good thing to also do is to realize that some people structure it, for example, 80%. What does 80% mean? It means 80% of the scenario's original speed. So if 100% would be the full speed, 120 would be 20% faster, and 80, 60, 70 would be slower movement speeds. And this is really, really good because if you're shaking in this scenario and you see 80, you know what? Don't be afraid to go down to 70. Play here. A same version, same everything. It's a little smaller, but it's moving way slower. Oh, I'm still shaking. Don't be afraid to go down even more to 50 and just go on and just go on until these shakes, these issues are fully gone. Again, as a beginner, strong recommend to do this. See, the truth about Smoothness is that you actually want to play the harder stuff, but you really can't. You have to build out the good habits in a slower scenario like the ones I just showed you. Spend a week or two purely isolating and learning how to smoothly track. And smoothly means smoothly. No shakes, nothing crazy, just complete control of the bot. Then slowly with time, you can incorporate faster moving scenarios and do the crazier stuff. But the important here is to not get ahead of yourself. If you can do something slowly, you can do it fast. But if you're rushing into harder stuff, you'll build these bad habits and the return might just even be negative. So how do we ensure we build good habits and not bad habits when playing Smoothness? Number one, again, if you're shaking, play it slower. We talked about that. Good. How do I remove autopiloting? Similar to when we talked about visual confirmations, we want to aim for the dead center of the bot. Always staying in the middle. No matter how large the bot is, always actively aim. This is what's known as actively aiming, by consciously always being locked on and focusing on one specific body part. Because if we're hitting just the edges like this, and then we go into our game, the targets might not be this large. This creates your body, essentially tells your body to, hey, I need to really focus up on this specific part, and I can't just autopilot and, oh, I'm hitting and it's cool and it's whatever, I'm still hitting and I'm doing great. No, you're going to be locked in and always focused on one part. This style of active aiming really helps to avoid autopiloting. Some other common issues I see in a scenario like this, for example, is people aiming at the head. This would be completely intuitive and completely makes sense, but unless the scenario is called HS or headshot, we want to actually be aiming at the torso. This is essentially to build up consistency and not overly focus on the precision part, but just being smooth with it. Another thing I see people frequently doing is moving in scenarios. I don't want you to move in scenarios unless the scenario is called dodge, which means movement, or a big warning sign like this will show up in your face. Boom. If it says move to earn more points, that's when you know, holy shit, I need to move in a scenario. So we'll talk about movement tracking in a little bit. I just want to cover some of those common mistakes. A common issue I see in Smoothness, and why a lot of people shake, is because they're overly ready for any small change in direction. Oh, he moved a little bit. Oh, he moved a little bit. Oh, he moved a little bit. And they'll overreact and be way too quick to react in their tracking. What I want you to do is to relax your arm a little bit, don't death grip your mouse, and realize that the target is doing way smaller changes in direction than you think. If he's moving a little bit, you don't need to snap back to target. You can do less mouse movement and focus on being smooth. If the target is a smoothness scenario, focus on being smooth. If the target is a reactive scenario, focus on being more reactive. Next up is reactive. Reactive can essentially be characterized as tracking, except the target does way sharper, quicker, and usually harder changes in direction. Smooth is very small, soft changes in direction, where reactive is more thought of as strafes, hard changes. So reactive, essentially this part, I'll show you. You're tracking, then the bot does a change in movement and you're reacting to him. You're tracking, reacting. So the reacting is how you essentially react to his change in movement and not the tracking part in between. This is what's called smoothness, or just generally tracking. But when he does a change in movement, which he'll do in a second, I hope, that's when the reactive part comes in. A good way to see if you have bad reactive is how long it takes you to react to his change in movement. If you're doing it sort of at the same time as he changes direction, you're still on target, means you have good reactive. If he changes direction and you're sort of leaving your crosser behind and then reacting late, that means you have poor reactive. This is what poor reactive will essentially look like. See how my reactions are really late compared to someone with good reactive who can just respond to those changes in movement. So this is a first step where you can see that smoothness sort of blends into reactive and reactive sort of blends into smoothness, and everything is sort of a part of the whole thing. It's just names we've put on you guys to hopefully understand the pattern and the thought process we're trying to attack. This is also where you can consider something like static being highly useful, because a person with poor reactive will also often flick back to the target. And what do we do in static? We flick back to target. So if we have poor static and poor overflicking, we'll overflick and then adjust, and it'll just, again, prolong the TTK because we're having to adjust again, instead of somebody with good snappiness, good flicking, who can just flick on target and be immediately. Again, you shouldn't flick back on target. You should be very smooth with your motion, but a lot of people who are beginners frequently have to flick back due to how poor and not used they are to these faster changes in direction. Now, there's different types of reactive. Number one, what you just saw is something called long strafes. What does that mean? It essentially means that he will be doing a long motion before switching direction. Long motion before switching direction. What is fast strafes is the opposite. Instead of doing a long motion, he will do a very quick, fast motion that requires more reactive. See how he's changing direction way more frequently compared to the longer strafe. Also something called mid strafes, which is sort of somewhere in between those, and short strafes, which is even faster changes in direction. It's really important when you're looking at this in the future is to identify where you're struggling. Is it the long strafe, the short strafe, the mid strafe, and try to attack that specifically. But again, that's in the future. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. A common issue that I see in reactive is predicting, meaning that you see that little slight change or that slight stop and you will predict where he will move next. And as we learned, all these forms of shaking, the lack of visual confirmation or predicting is randomness. It's your body's ability to try to fill in the gaps, to assume or guess what will happen because you don't know. And we want to always know rather than react randomly. And essentially, we know how to react through skill and through getting better. That's why the fundamentals, the easy stuff, is so important to hit as a beginner. So you essentially fight predicting by two things: actively aiming, which is always aiming at the center of the bot, and number two is to stop trying to anticipate any change in direction and simply be aware that they will happen and be a little bit more relaxed with your arm. You don't need to be hyper aware, similar to Smoothness, to any possible change in direction. When a change in direction happens, that's when you react, not preemptively. Another thing I see is this. Now, you might be a little scared because you see at the top, the scenario is the scenario 16 minutes. The scenario is not 60 minutes long. It's essentially the quicker you kill these bots, which are, for example, 5 bots, the quicker the scenario ends. So it's not 60 minutes. It's how long it takes you to kill these 5 bots. What this is if I kill this guy, essentially it will give me another pattern. And this is really, really good for people who struggle with predicting because you'll always be thrown into different patterns all the time, challenging your short strafes, mid strafes, long strafes, etc., etc. Really good and useful for beginners are these plaza or ground style of scenarios. Another word is also air, which focuses more on the smoothness part. So now we'll talk about movement tracking. It's very important that you only move when this scenario is called dodge, or like I told you, when this warning sign comes up in your face, not in any other scenario. What you want to do is anti-mirroring. What is anti-mirroring? Doing the opposite direction of him. So he's moving left right now. I want to be moving the opposite direction. He's moving right, I want to be moving the opposite direction, and always countering his movement. This will work to essentially make it harder for him to hit you and at the same time assist your aim, to synchronize your aim so you're moving and aiming at the same time. We don't want the moving and the aiming to be separate. What frequently many people do is they cheese it, where they essentially just mirror. This is called mirroring, where you're moving in the same pattern as the target. And this is in-game very circumstantial because you won't do the exact same pattern as the enemy will do in-game. And more so, you're practicing to always have your mouse frozen rather than reactive to different potential changes in movement, because in-game you never really know what the enemy will do. And this type of exercises are super important for any type of game, especially if you play attack FPS games, since people in attack FPS games often have to stop before initializing the movement. And the movement, the aiming and the shooting is two completely different things. You can move and aim without shooting, which is exactly what I want you to do in game. So now we talked a lot about tracking. How do we build this playlist? Well, firstly, we want some linear tracking. And since this is the beginning step, we want to add different types of linear tracking. Again, keeping it easy to make sure we don't shake. We also want to add some raw smoothness, which is those predictable patterns again, to sort of iron out any mistakes we have. So from a smoothness perspective, we have centering 90, which is a larger target moving in a 90-degree field of view. No strafe, so it's just going to be moving left to right all the time. And then we have a little thinner version and a 180 field, which is also not going to be strafing and focusing more on our precision. Again, linear tracking. And then we have a little bigger one, which is going to be focusing on these wider swings. Again, all working these linear movement patterns. The reason linear is so overworked is similar to why Pokeball is overworked. It's that initial step. It's in everything. It's how you react. It's if you're playing reactive in the future, how do you blend your reactive and your linear tracking? So essentially, it's the core, it's the base of smoothness, which is why it's really important to get it working well without any shakes from the beginning as a ground step, and then work your way slowly upwards. We then have some raw smoothness, which is just going to be focused again on predictable and repeated patterns. So again, we don't sit there and shake like this, but we can actually smoothly track something. It's not that, oh, I'm going to track jumping targets. It's more, how does my body react to these repeated and smooth motions? Can I smoothly track? Can I not? More so than the exact pattern, size, or whatever's happening on screen. It's more, how do you react? How do you handle it? We also have something like this, which just moves in a smooth pattern and adds a little bit of reactivity into the mix by sometimes changing a little bit direction. Then we have something like reactive. I strongly recommend, as a beginner, you focus on these long strafe scenarios. Don't focus on fast strafes just yet. Get a good idea for, how do I track a target moving these longer strafes that have some smoothness, some reactivity, rather than being overly focused on changes in direction constantly. We then want to add some dodge scenarios to incorporate that synchronization between movement and tracking. This is a really good scenario that just works the basic. How do you react to a change in movement? And don't be afraid here to put easy scenarios, because even if it feels like you're hitting, I guarantee you're still making mistakes. This is how your aim might look like. This is what I frequently see. And it feels like, hey, I'm hitting the target, I'm doing great, but guess what? You're not smooth. You have a lot of issues that still come up with your aim. And that's what we want to address more so than how our score is or how much it feels like we're hitting. Now I want to talk about fundamentals. What is fundamentals is something I get asked all the time. Well, it's actually this, which is pretty confusing, but the easiest way I can say it like this: it's the simplest and easiest form of aim training. It's larger, predictable, and slower moving scenario. The goal isn't to jump hoops in skill, but build your base where you don't shake, don't overly react, and can draw a straight, clean line to the target. The idea is that our bodies can then use this building block for our future aim requirements when we really need to push ourselves and get better. So it sounds funny, but you need to ignore your score and goals and focus on first removing your bad habits. That's what fundamentals is and what it does. So now you got all these scenarios, but they're all scattered randomly. What do you do? This is where structure comes into play. This is the first part of the flick, meaning your mouse movement without any other input. We work on this before our static. Why? Because now static implies a movement of the mouse, a confirmation, and a click. So we're adding an extra input. That means that we want to put our Pokeball ahead of our switching. Sorry, our Pokeball ahead of our clicking. And since target switching sort of follows a similar suit, we want to add that as well. So now we have Pokeball and target switching, which are essentially your how do you react with your mouse movement ahead of the next step, which is clicking. Some people also prefer doing static and then dynamic. I personally prefer doing dynamic ahead of static. Why? Because we're building another form of confirmation where we have to make sure we're on target, incorporate a little bit of tracking before moving to the simpler step, which is something like this. Essentially, you're doing something a little bit harder before moving on to something a little bit easier and making sure you have the fundamentals there. With smoothness, a lot of people prefer to place smooth scenarios since it's again the beginning and easiest step ahead of something harder like close long strafes, which requires sort of reactive and smoothness. I personally like to place my dodge at the end, but a lot of people do different things. Some people like the reactive ahead of their smoothness. Why? So they'll finish the smoothness, they'll finish the playlist off with smooth aim and all these smoothness scenarios that calm their aim down. Since reactive can sometimes force people to be a little bit overly tense, which if you're in that case, relax your arm as well. Every single person who's listening to this issue is unique and have different issues. That's why experimentation and figuring out what works for you and what doesn't is crucial. For some people, looking at the bot might work perfectly, and others, decelerations make work. That's why you have to try everything, regardless if it appeals to you or not. Try, experiment, then make your decision. Nothing in aim training has any science behind it, not what I say and not what other people say. Everyone simply has different needs. That's why I try to give you guys all the information and let you experiment for yourself. Figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and realize that the thing that you apply may not apply to everyone. Aim training is no different than anything else in life. If something is true in other aspects or other sports, it may also be true in aim training. For example, how genetics or natural talents actually play a part to how quickly you can learn, or how conditioning in the gym is very normal as you start light and slowly start to increase your weight, similar, and do more complex workouts. Similar to aim training, you want to start off easy and then slowly start hitting the heavier, harder stuff. So that's structure. We covered all different aim fields. And yes, I will upload this playlist and it'll be in the bottom of the description. That's it. Again, if you like the way I break things down, do consider signing up for my coaching. Peace and love.